Friday night in Indianapolis felt like something different. The kind of night where you stop scrolling, stop talking, and just watch. Caitlin Clark was doing something on a basketball court that almost nobody in the history of the sport had ever done before. And by the time the final buzzer sounded, the entire basketball world was trying to process what they had just witnessed. 45 points, 10 assists, 4 steals, 2 blocks. A stat line so rare, so historically absurd that only 4 other players across all of professional basketball, men's or women's, had ever produced anything like it. And she did it in under 30 minutes, still playing under a minutes restriction her own coaching staff hadn't lifted yet. Analysts were pulling up Michael Jordan comparisons. Luka Doncic's name was being thrown around. Social media was running out of ways to describe what had just happened. For one night, everything about Caitlin Clark was about basketball, and only basketball. What she did on the floor, what it meant for the record books, and what it suggested about where her career was heading. Then came Saturday. 90 seconds. That's how long it took for the entire conversation to flip. 90 seconds into Indiana's next game against the New York Liberty, Clark ran into a hard screen set by Liberty center Jonquel Jones. She went to the floor, she looked for the foul call. It never came. She got up, said something to the nearest official, and was handed a technical foul on the spot. Her 6th of the season. $1,000 out of her pocket before the game had barely started. And suddenly, the player who had just joined one of the rarest clubs in basketball history was now sitting 2 technical fouls away from an automatic 1-game suspension. The celebrations from the night before hadn't even fully died down yet. The slow-motion highlight reels were still circulating on every timeline, and here was the league hitting its most-watched player with a fine before she had even settled into her 2nd game of the weekend. How does a sport go from witnessing history on a Friday to disciplining the same person who made that history less than 24 hours later? That question landed hard, and it didn't land quietly. The Fever won the game. Kelsey Mitchell poured in 33 points and helped Indiana close out a comfortable 108-88 victory over a Liberty team that had beaten them earlier in the season. By any measure, it was a strong road win with playoff implications for a team sitting at 15 wins and 10 losses, fighting for positioning in a conference that had gotten tighter by the week. But the win barely registered in the headlines. What registered was the technical. What registered was the fine. What registered was the math. 6 down, 2 to go before a mandatory night off, and the fact that fans had spent the previous evening celebrating one of the greatest individual performances in women's basketball history, only to spend the following night counting fouls like a suspension clock. That whiplash wasn't accidental. It wasn't bad timing or an unfortunate coincidence. For the people who had been watching closely all season, it was the latest chapter in something that had been building for months, one disputed whistle at a time. To understand why Saturday felt like the latest explosion in a much longer fire, you have to go back to June, because that's where this story actually starts. Clark picked up a technical foul against the Phoenix Mercury in a game that many fans and analysts immediately flagged as borderline at best, the kind of call that disappears for most players, the kind that referees swallow in the heat of a physical moment and move on from without making it a moment. But it didn't disappear. The league reviewed it, and instead of rescinding it the way it had done for other players earlier that same season, the WNBA upheld it. That single decision lit the fuse, not because one technical foul is a catastrophe, but because of what it revealed about how Clark's situation was being handled compared to everyone else on the floor. Fans noticed immediately. Screenshots of the decision started circulating within hours. Social media timelines filled with side-by-side comparisons, players with similar or rougher on-court behavior, players with comparable frustration levels, players who had said or done far more in the heat of the moment, none of whom were drawing the same level of scrutiny or the same disciplinary outcomes. Why does a call that gets rescinded for one player stand for another in the exact same season? That question became the lens through which every subsequent technical foul would be viewed. And it never went away.
By the time the 6th technical arrived in July, fans weren't reacting to a single bad call. They were reacting to a file they had been building since spring, screenshot by screenshot, box score by box score. Every disputed whistle cataloged, discussed, and held up against a pattern they were increasingly convinced the league either couldn't see or was choosing not to address. The June call didn't just cost Clark a fine, it cost the league the benefit of the doubt from a fan base that had already been paying close attention and was now paying attention with a magnifying glass. What makes this situation harder to dismiss as fan frustration or online noise is who else has been willing to say something about it publicly. Stephanie White is Indiana's head coach. She is not a fan account. She is not a social media commentator with no accountability for what she says. She is a professional coach whose job depends on managing her team carefully and speaking about officiating in ways that don't create additional problems with the league office. And even she has addressed the pattern directly, telling reporters after an earlier technical that there needed to be conversations about being more strategic with how those fouls get used against her own player. Read that carefully. A head coach speaking on the record, acknowledging that Clark's relationship with WNBA officiating has become something the organization has to actively manage, not something they hope goes away, not something they're brushing off as an overreaction from the internet, something they are strategically planning around. When a team's coaching staff is choosing its words this carefully in public about a pattern this visible, it tells you everything about how serious the issue has become inside the organization itself. National media has been paying attention too. Commentators across major sports outlets have used phrases like political tug-of-war to describe the dynamic surrounding Clark's treatment. Praised as the league's biggest draw one week, disciplined more visibly than her peers the next. Once that framing escapes the WNBA-specific coverage and lands in broader sports conversation, the league no longer controls the narrative. The conversation controls itself. Casual fans who had never thought twice about technical foul procedures are now asking questions about consistency and fairness because the story has grown large enough that it reaches them. That is a different kind of pressure than a strongly worded tweet from a fan base. That is the league's image being shaped in real time by a conversation it did not choose to start and cannot simply wait out. Look at where Clark sits in the league's technical foul standings, and the picture gets even harder to explain away. She is currently tied for second in the entire league, sitting behind only Angel Reese and level with Kalia Copper. Those are three players whose games look almost nothing alike. Reese is a physical interior presence who plays with an edge and draws physical play. Copper is an aggressive two-way guard who attacks the basket relentlessly. Clark is a perimeter playmaker whose style is built more around spacing, passing, and shooting than the kind of contact-heavy, emotionally combustible play you might expect to produce technical fouls at a high rate. So what exactly explains three such different players ending up in the same disciplinary bracket by the midpoint of the season? The shared number is harder to explain as coincidence than it sounds. It invites questions. And when those questions don't get answered clearly, fans fill the silence with their own conclusions, and the ones they're reaching aren't favorable to the league office. The fan base has responded to that silence with something remarkably organized for something that emerged entirely without any formal structure behind it. Every technical foul now generates its own immediate wave of real-time commentary and documentation. Fans refreshing box scores mid-game specifically to track whether Clark has picked up a foul that pushes her closer to the threshold. Screenshot threads that catalog every disputed call with timestamps and video evidence. Comparison posts that hold up Clark's technical foul history next to players whose conduct is objectively similar or worse. This is not random venting. This is a fan base that has effectively turned itself into a fact-checking department, organized, persistent, and completely unwilling to let any single call slip by unnoticed. What does it mean for a league office when the people watching its games this closely are building a public record of every decision it makes? That kind of sustained, documented attention is its own form of pressure, even without a formal campaign or a petition or a spokesperson. It just keeps existing, and it keeps growing every time a new chapter gets added.
There is also a financial dimension to all of this that deserves more scrutiny than it typically gets. The WNBA quietly restructured its fine system heading into the season. Under the new framework, technical fouls 4 through 7 each carry a $1,000 penalty, a dramatic jump from the $200 starting point of previous seasons. That change was implemented across the board, but in practice it lands differently depending on who is accumulating the fouls. For a player like Clark, who is approaching the threshold faster than almost anyone else in the league, the financial cost of frustration has been climbing steeply and quickly. $1,000 per technical foul sounds like a number that a professional athlete can absorb, but the deeper issue isn't the dollar amount, it's what the structure reveals about the league's priorities. Raising the cost of player frustration while the consistency of the calls producing that frustration stays exactly where it was shifts the entire burden onto the player. It says, in effect, that the answer to inconsistency is to make it more expensive to react to. That framing has not gone unnoticed among supporters who believe the officiating problem is the underlying cause, not the result of Clark's behavior. Clark herself has not framed this as a personal grievance. She has been notably careful about that, steering the conversation consistently away from individual calls and toward a structural argument. Her ask, the one she has repeated publicly throughout the season, is for full-time referees instead of the part-time officiating system the league currently relies on. That is a meaningful distinction. She is not asking for preferential treatment. She is not asking the league to go back and overturn specific calls in her favor. She is making the argument that inconsistency in officiating is fundamentally a staffing and infrastructure problem, and that fixing it would benefit everyone on the floor, not just her. That argument gives her position a credibility that pure frustration wouldn't carry. It reframes the entire conversation from Clark thinks she gets too many technical fouls to Clark thinks the league's officiating structure needs to improve. Those are two very different arguments, and the second one is a lot harder for the league office to dismiss without looking like it's choosing not to fix a fixable problem. So what actually happens if the 8th technical arrives? Strip away the drama and the mechanics are straightforward. The moment Clark picks up her 8th technical foul of the regular season, the WNBA automatically suspends her for 1 game. No hearing, no appeal that changes the outcome, a $1,500 fine on top of it, and a mandatory night on the bench. For most players on most teams in most seasons, that would be an inconvenience. For the Fever, right now, it would be something considerably more serious. Indiana is sitting at 15 wins and 10 losses, locked in a playoff race in a conference that has tightened significantly as the season has progressed. Clark is averaging close to 21 points, nearly 8 assists and 4 rebounds per night. She is not just Indiana's best player, she is the gravitational center of everything the Fever run on offense. The player whose ability to create open looks for her teammates fundamentally changes how the defense has to deploy, and the player whose shooting range alone forces adjustments that no other player on the roster can demand in the same way. Remove her for 1 game, and the Fever aren't just missing a scorer, they're running an entirely different offense on 48 hours' notice, in the middle of a stretch where every game carries playoff weight. How does a team reroute its entire offensive identity that quickly without months of practice and preparation built around a different approach? The honest answer is that it doesn't. Not cleanly, not without cost. But the damage from a suspension wouldn't stop at Indiana's 1-loss record. Every game Clark appears in this season comes with something the league has spent years trying to generate: elevated attendance, elevated television ratings, and a level of mainstream national attention that women's basketball has historically struggled to sustain consistently. Every arena she visits sells out. Broadcasters point to her appearances as reliable drivers of viewership. The league has openly credited her presence with accelerating the growth of the sport in ways that extend well beyond any single marketing campaign could have produced. A suspension doesn't just cost the Fever a player for a night, it costs the league one of its most reliable draws, at exactly the moment that casual fans are paying more attention to women's basketball than they ever have before. Is the WNBA actually prepared for what a suspended night looks like in terms of the audience it loses alongside her? That is not a hypothetical anymore. It is a live question, sitting 2 technical fouls away from becoming a very real answer. Fans have started treating every single technical foul from this point forward as its own contained drama, refreshing box scores in real time during fever games specifically to see if Clark has picked up a foul that pushes the counter forward, watching her interactions with officials with a level of forensic attention that would be unusual even in a playoff series. Every time she says something to a referee after a call, there's a moment, a collective breath across social media before people find out whether it resulted in anything. That kind of sustained, granular attention is exhausting for everyone involved, including and especially Clark herself. She is a competitor. She plays with intensity and emotion because that's what competitive basketball at the highest level demands. Being asked to manage that intensity, not just with the game on the line, but with a suspension countdown ticking in the background, creates a psychological pressure that very few athletes in any sport have had to navigate this publicly. How many players in any professional league are expected to regulate their emotional responses this carefully, with this much riding on every single whistle? The answer is not many, and the ones who are usually have something in common. They're the biggest names, generating the biggest audiences, and carrying the most institutional weight. Which brings the conversation right back to Clark. None of this is an argument that she should get a pass on legitimate technical fouls. Nobody is making that case. The argument is simpler and less comfortable for the league, that the margin for error has become dangerously thin at exactly the moment her performance has never been better, and the stakes for everyone around her, teammates, coaches, broadcasters, the league itself, have never been higher. Is it reasonable to ask any athlete, let alone the most scrutinized one in the sport, to play with that little room between her best season and a forced night off? Look at everything Clark has already had to manage just to get to this point in the season, and the picture gets heavier. She came into the year dealing with injury concerns that required her coaching staff to implement a minutes restriction that is still in place. The physical contact she absorbs on a nightly basis has been documented and debated since her rookie season, a level of contact that has drawn its own separate conversation about how the officials are applying the rules consistently when it comes to how she's defended. Now, layer on top of all of that a suspension threshold that sits 2 technical fouls away, a fine structure that penalizes her more steeply with each additional call, and a league office that has not publicly responded to the structural concerns she keeps raising. That is a significant amount of pressure concentrated on one player at one time. And it is landing during what should be one of the most celebratory stretches of her career, a week that opened with a 45-point, 10-assist historic performance, and then pivoted immediately into a fine and a suspension countdown. The contrast between those two things is not subtle. It is exactly the kind of contradiction that makes a narrative feel bigger than any individual moment inside it. For the Fever fan base, this stretch of the season has created a kind of divided attention that no team should have to deal with in the middle of a playoff push. Part of every game is just watching basketball, and part of every game is watching a counter, waiting to see if this is the whistle that changes everything. That is the undercurrent running through every Indiana broadcast right now, a tension that wasn't there a season ago and that only exists because the situation has been allowed to escalate without any clear resolution from the people with the authority to actually provide one. Everything this situation involves, the fine on July 18th, the June call that never got overturned, the structural ask for full-time referees, the suspension math, the fan documentation, the head coach speaking carefully in public about managing a problem that shouldn't exist, all of it traces back to one central question. Does the WNBA plan to actually answer Caitlin Clark?
Not with a statement. Not with a fine structure update buried in league memo language. Actually answer her. Engage with the argument she's been making publicly and repeatedly that the officiating inconsistency is a structural problem with a structural solution, and respond to it in a way that makes clear the league has heard what she's saying and is doing something meaningful about it. Because right now, the response has been silence and fines applied consistently enough start to look like a policy. Fans have been counting every whistle since spring, and they are not stopping. The media attention that started in WNBA coverage has spread into mainstream sports conversation, and it is not retreating. And Clark herself has shown no indication of softening her position or pulling back from the public argument she has been making all season. That is 3 directions of pressure, from the supporters, from the commentators, from the player herself, landing simultaneously on a league office that has not yet found a way to respond without making the situation worse or the problem more visible. The countdown sits at 2. 2 more technical fouls, and the conversation stops being about what might happen and starts being about what is happening. 2 more whistles, and the league's most watched player is sitting on the bench for a game that will be covered not as a standard disciplinary outcome, but as the culmination of a story that has been building since June. Every remaining game on Indiana's schedule carries playoff weight. Every possession matters, and every single one of those games was built around the assumption that Clark would be on the floor, running an offense that only works the way it's designed to work when she's in the middle of it. Whether the 8th technical arrives in the next 2 weeks or never comes at all, the pressure is already real. The question it raises is already in the room. A league that has spent 2 seasons openly crediting one player with reshaping the commercial and cultural trajectory of the sport is now 2 bad whistles away from sitting that same player down in the middle of a playoff race. And the people watching are not confused about what that would mean. They are simply waiting to see if the league is. The fan base has built its record. The media has built its narrative. Clark has made her argument. Now, the only question left is whether the WNBA is actually listening, or whether it's just going to keep cashing the fines and hoping the noise eventually dies down. It won't. If you think the WNBA owes Clark a real answer on this, say so in the comments. And if this breakdown gave you something to think about, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is nowhere near over.